You'd think the invention of fire would be the biggest cave story, but no. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we're talking about who kept that fire going, while also stuffing pillows, storing roots, and making the floor less like rock and more like home. A sleeping bear doesn't care about thread count, but you'd notice the mat of soft moss, the smoky warmth on your toes, and the faint whiff of dried mint tucked near the sleeping alcove. What made a cave livable? Why didn't they all just freeze? And how much of our idea of home began under stone ceilings? If you've ever made a blanket fort out of boredom, you might owe thanks to a Paleolithic woman. A quick tap on like and subscribe is like throwing another log on the fire, quietly warming the next tale. Sometimes I wonder whose footsteps echo in your sleepiest history dreams. Feel free to whisper them in the comments. Now dim, the lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You enter the cave not as a guest, but as someone expected. There's no door, no welcome mat, but signs of warmth are everywhere. Close to the center, a ring of stones cradles a fire still flickering from last night. Around it lie flattened bundles of grass, covered in stitched animal skins, arranged not randomly, but in small circles, like sleepy petals facing a flame. This is no wild den. This is a home, and it's likely a woman built its rhythm. The first archaeological hints that women shaped these spaces come not from tools of war, but from signs of care. Piles of dry moss appear in tucked corners, perhaps once used as bedding or insulation. Animal hides show not just marks of butchery, but careful scoring, folding even attempts at tanning with plant acids. In one cave in southern France, paleobotanists found tiny remnants of crushed herbs, wild mint chamomile and yarrow, stuffed in places where heads might have rested. Not medicinal caches, likely pillows. Historians once imagined these caves as crude shelters where men returned from the hunt dragging meat and smoke. But the evidence shifts the scene. Someone had to gather firewood, keep embers alive, repair the hide door flaps, and chase off the damp. And that someone, more often than not, appears to be female. Not just because of gender roles, as we know them, but due to clues like the concentration of tools for scraping hides, weaving fibers, or grinding roots found consistently near the center of hearths. There's debate, of course. Some archaeologists argue these signs could point to shared labor. Others suggest the layout reflects the work of a designated group within the tribe, perhaps elderly women too old to hunt, but carrying the wisdom of how to keep a cave from turning into a coffin of cold air. Surviving evidence is partial fragile. A bent awl here, a burnt layer of moss there. Still patterns whisper, and whisper they must, because the cave doesn't shout. It hums. The rhythm of daily tasks, grinding, weaving, stirring, might have formed the earliest lullabies. Imagine being a child in that cave, curled beside a smoky hearth, while someone hums a pattern that matches her hand motions. Stir, beat, tie, hum. Stories passed mouth to mouth, but comfort that came from hands and fire. Later in seasonal shifts, these same women likely oversaw the dismantling and remaking of camps, judging where sun would fall, where wind would curl in too sharply. That kind of knowing isn't brute skill. It's memory intuition, an experience passed quietly between generations. So, next time you picture a Paleolithic cave, don't stop at shadows and spear tips. Add warmth rhythm and an early blueprint for home, and give credit to the hands that made stone feel soft. The handprints float along the cave walls like ghostly signatures, some small, some larger, many with splayed fingers, red or ochre outlines whispering across millennia. Step closer and you'll notice something odd. Most of these prints are not large or broad. In fact, they look delicate, feminine even. But what can a handprint truly reveal? That's the question that sparked more than one scholarly argument around prehistoric campfires, some real, most metaphorical. You wander deeper into the cave, tracing your fingers just beneath the ancient stencils. They're not painted directly with fingertips. Instead, someone placed their hand on the wall and sprayed pigment over it, probably through a hollow reed or their own mouth. This left behind a negative, a ghost hand, not a mark of touch, but of presence withheld. And many of these ghost hands are small. Some researchers analyzing finger-length ratios, especially the ratio between the index and ring fingers, have concluded that over 70% of sampled prints in several major cave sites appear to belong to women. This doesn't just challenge the stereotype of male-only cave artists, it cracks it wide open. But not everyone agrees. Other scholars caution that using modern Western populations as reference points might mislead the analysis. After all, human biology can vary dramatically across time-space and diet. Still, the debate rages softly, like smoke curling through ancient rafters. What's certain is that someone with intimate access to the cave's inner spaces made the effort to leave their mark. And many of those marks feel intentionally placed. Some are clustered near depictions of animals, others near abstract symbols or ritual spaces. If these were ceremonial acts, they were done by people who carried not just pigment, but purpose. Now imagine the moment a woman kneeling beside the cave wall, guiding her child's hand into position. Puff pigment bursts like breath across stone. A pause, then a giggle, or perhaps a hush, another puff. The stencils multiply, echoing forward through time. You find one spot where a row of handprints cascades downward in a curve, almost like falling leaves. Were these a form of storytelling? A family tree? A personal prayer? Some archaeologists speculate that they served as territorial markers or even as primitive calendars. But the truth remains elusive. One particularly haunting discovery came in a small chamber deep in the Spanish cave of El Castillo. There, a single handprint rests beside red disc shapes over 37,000 years old. It's among the oldest cave art in Europe, and it may well have been made by a woman. It makes you wonder what compelled her to leave her hand there in that moment. Was it joy, grief ritual, or just the ancient human urge to whisper I was here? Of all the messages left by early humans, these handprints might be the most intimate. They aren't scenes of heroism or glory. They're impressions of presence, silent gestures reaching through time. And if they belong to women, and many likely did, then history must learn to listen, not just to the loud clangs of invention and war, but to the soft hiss of pigment over stone. The cave might look like gray stillness, but tucked between the shadows, a different kind of color story unfolds, one born not of hunting, but of collecting. You kneel near a faded drawing of a bison and notice the pigment. Not dirt brown or soot black, but something richer, a dusky red that gleams faintly in the firelight. That shimmer didn't just happen. Someone had to find it. Someone had to know. And more often than not, that someone may have been a woman with a knack for spotting the extraordinary in the ordinary. Step outside the cave into daylight, and the task becomes clearer. Pigments didn't grow on trees. They came from crushed minerals, hematite for red manganese oxide, for black ground malachite for greenish hues. Some needed to be pounded into dust, others mixed with animal fat or saliva. A few, like the deep blues from lapis lazuli, were so rare and remote they wouldn't show up in Europe for many millennia. But ochres, those you could find if you knew where to look. Researchers have begun mapping pigment sources and comparing them to cave art locations. The surprising result, in many areas, the pigment traveled. It didn't just happen to be near the cave, it had to be brought there. And that meant journeying long distances, often on foot, through forest and ridge. Not in the heat of the hunt, but on a quieter, more deliberate quest. And here's where the evidence bends toward women. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show that pigment collecting herbal medicine and even early chemical experimentation, like binding agents or drying techniques, were often women's domains. That doesn't prove cave women did the same, but it nudges us to consider the possibility. One dig in Zambia revealed bundles of ochre buried with female skeletons, suggesting not just casual use, but some personal or ceremonial significance. Another site in France found residues of crushed petals, resins, and red dust in hide pouches near what appears to be a communal area, likely where pigments were prepared and shared. Now imagine her striding down a riverside with a stone bowl in hand, scanning cliffs for that perfect blush of mineral, maybe tasting a flake on her tongue. She knows what's safe, what stains, what shimmers. Her children might trail behind her learning by watching, by sniffing, by sneaking a finger into the mixture when she's not looking. She's not just gathering for beauty. Pigment had power. Some minerals had antibacterial properties. Others repelled insects. Still more were used in rituals to mark births, death seasons. A smear of red across the forehead might mean something sacred, or just something practical. Scholars still debate how much symbolism lived in these colors. Was red always blood? Was white always spirit? Or did meanings shift like the river's mood? Whatever the case, the collectors of color weren't passive. They experimented, refined, and remembered. In their hands, clay and dust became more than earth. They became memory, medicine, and meaning. And as you walk deeper into the painted chamber, the air thick with pigment and smoke, you see their legacy, not shouted, but brushed softly into stone. From the outside, it's just a lump of stone, nothing to write home about. But in the hands of a Paleolithic woman, that lump twists into a thread, stretches into a net, knots itself into something unexpectedly useful. Before there were looms, before the wheel even rolled into existence, there were fibers, twisted, teased, and woven into the beginnings of fabric. And it seems women may have been the ones quietly spinning the world into order. You crouch by a pile of excavated tools, awls made from bone-perforated stones for weight spindle whirls that once twirled like lazy planets. They're small, easy to overlook, beside the drama of spears and mammoth skulls. But these objects hold a different kind of story, one that's soft looping and often overlooked. In caves across Europe and the Near East, archaeologists have unearthed strands of ancient thread, twisted plant fibers, some dyed, some knotted into rudimentary netting. At first glance, the evidence seems sparse. But under microscopes and chemical analysis, the story begins to tighten. Someone was making things. Nets for fishing, slings for carrying babies, mats for sleeping, bags for gathering herbs, all before pottery, before wheels, before history officially began. And while it's dangerous to declare ancient labor as definitively gendered, there are patterns. In contemporary foraging societies, tasks like fiber preparation, weaving, and net making are most often taught and transmitted through women. That doesn't mean men never did it, but it hints at a strong association. especially when the tools are consistently found in spaces closer to hearths and communal areas. One remarkable clue comes from a 20,000-year-old Venus figurine carved with what appears to be a woven cap or hairnet. Scholars long assumed these were stylized hairdos or symbolic markings, but new studies suggest they might depict real textiles, actual woven headgear, or body wraps. If true, it implies that textiles were not just functional, but fashionable, used to express status identity, maybe even group affiliation. What makes it all the more fascinating is how little of this survives. Fiber rots. Plant threads vanish in damp soil. What's left are the tools, the weight of a loomstone, the groove in a bone needle, the residue of twisted bast fibers clinging to a hearthstone. These fragments whisper of women, bent over mats, hands calloused from twisting reeds, humming as they loop cord into basketry or stitch hide into carry pouches. Debate still bubbles among scholars over when exactly textiles began. Some argue for a Neolithic start tied to settled farming. Others point to deeper evidence fiber impressions on 30,000-year-old clay shards, where patterns on Paleolithic tools and the quiet persistence of weaving techniques across cultures. No matter where you pin the origin, one thing is clear. Long before fashion, long before thread counts, in couture there was purpose, and perhaps pride. So next time you run your fingers over a soft blanket, imagine its ancestor twisted under starlight by firelight in the rhythmic hands of a cavewoman who may have been thinking not just of warmth, but of beauty. There's a quiet precision to it, the curve of a bone, the chip of flint, the whisper of sinew sliding into a groove. It's not the chaotic clang of swords or the bluster of brawny hunters. It's subtler, steadier. And increasingly, the evidence suggests that women in the Paleolithic weren't just using tools. They were making them with care, finesse, and a deep knowledge of materials. You pick up a replica of a barbed harpoon. It's beautiful in a brutal kind of way. Carved from antler, its notches are symmetrical, the tip honed to a wicked point. For years, tools like this were attributed exclusively to men, the assumption being that weapon making was a man's domain. But new discoveries muddy that narrative like a mammoth trudging through a stream. At a burial site in Peru, archaeologists found a 9,000-year-old skeleton, a female interred with a complete hunter's toolkit stone point scraper's blades. Not ceremonial trinkets, but well-used gear. This discovery sent ripples through the academic community, challenging long-held assumptions about who crafted and wielded such tools. And it's not the only case. Microscopic wear analysis on bone awls and needles from Europe and Asia shows marks from repeated use, indicating these weren't occasional hobbies, but daily tasks. Many of these tools were found in domestic contexts, suggesting that crafting wasn't a side note to survival, it was central. And much of it, researchers argue, was likely done by women. Imagine her now, seated on a low stone, hunched, slightly eyes narrowed as she angles a flint shard. She taps, turns, scrapes. Not for fun. For function. The tool she's shaping might gut fish, pierce hide, or trim sinew for lashing. A child watches nearby, mimicking her movements with a dull stone. Learning not just how to make a tool, but how to make it right. In some sites like Sungir in Russia, the tools buried with individuals show signs of craftsmanship so refined that some archaeologists speculate about early artisan specialists. One grave contained a young girl, buried with thousands of ivory beads, each meticulously shaped and polished. Her community clearly valued her not just as a child, but perhaps as someone who made things that mattered. Still, debates persist. Were women full-time tool makers, or did they specialize in certain items like fishing gear or hide scrapers while men handled projectile points? There's no scholarly consensus. The surviving evidence bias by preservation and interpretation leaves room for argument. But the growing body of data pushes us to reconsider simplistic gender lines. One quirky detail: some Paleolithic bone tools appear to have been decorated tiny incisions, patterns, or even faint dye traces. Function didn't preclude form. A fishing hook could also be beautiful. A sewing needle, etched with care, might carry its own story. So as you hold that replica harpoon, feel its balance. It wasn't made in haste. It was shaped by someone who understood the grain of bone, the weight of water, and the quiet satisfaction of getting it just right. And more often than not, that someone may have answered to Mama. There's a rustle in the brush, a quiet shift of branches, the subtle click of stone against antler. You freeze, not in fear, but in coordination. You're not alone on this hunt. Beside you, crouched low and steady, is your partner, not a grizzled man with a spear, but a woman balancing a net in one hand and a sling in the other. The man hunts, woman gathers model. It's due for retirement. The myth is tidy. Men chase prey. Women pick berries. But real life as usual was messier and much more collaborative. You follow the movement of a prehistoric hunting party across an open plain. Children, elders, men and women, all moving in sync. A strategy unfolds. Women and younger members flush small animals out of dense cover, guiding them toward traps or into the path of nets. It's not a high-speed chase, but a slow choreography honed over seasons. Anthropologists studying modern foraging societies, like the Hadza of Tanzania, have long noticed the same thing. Women hunt, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Not always for the same animals, not always with the same tools, but hunt they do. And when we turn the archaeological lens back in time, the signs of shared labor become hard to ignore. In ancient campsites, bones of small game rabbits, birds, turtles, bear cut marks and scorch patterns. These species don't require brute strength or long treks. They require patience, knowledge of habitat, and tools like digging sticks, nets, or snares, many of which may have been crafted or deployed by women. One quirky find: a stash of bird bones with their feathers carefully removed, discovered near a communal hearth. Some researchers believe these weren't just meals, they may have been collected by women for ceremonial purposes or feathered garments. Utility and symbolism intertwined. Of course, this model of shared foraging and cooperative hunting hasn't always been accepted. For decades, the man-the-hunter theory dominated textbooks and documentaries. But as more female skeletons turn up buried with hunting tools, and as reanalysis of older digs brings new insights, the narrative is shifting. Some scholars argue that hunting was task-divided not by gender, but by situation. Who was available? Who was skilled? Who was nursing? Who was injured? These practical questions likely shaped roles far more than rigid binaries. Imagine the communication involved: a quick glance, a hand signal, a low whistle. You step carefully over fallen leaves, matching her stride. She knows the nesting spots, the burrows, the timing of migration. Her knowledge isn't ornamental, it's essential. There's something profound about this shared labor. It blurs the boundary between home and hunt, between provision and protection. It suggests a society where competence mattered more than category. And maybe, just maybe, your ancient ancestors thrived not because they split roles by gender, but because they didn't. They worked together. They learned from each other. They adapted. So next time someone offers you the hunter-gatherer story with a gendered flourish hand, them a digging stick and a net, and let the cave women show them how it's done. The wind outside howls low, dragging mist across the tundra. But inside the mammoth hide shelter, the air is thick with warmth and worry. You can't see much in the firelight, just silhouettes moving quietly, the faint rustle of hands soaked in ash, the whisper of cloth being wrung out. At the center lies a laboring figure, knees drawn, breath ragged. This isn't just survival, it's birth. And the midwives of the Ice Age are ready. For years, the idea of Paleolithic childbirth was wrapped in assumptions, painful, lonely, fatal. But new interpretations of skeletal evidence, fossil positioning, and burial contexts are telling a more nuanced story, one where women didn't face birth alone, and where knowledge, not chaos, shaped the moment new life arrived. You sit back on your haunches and observe. The mammoth hide tent is carefully arranged. A pit fire flickers low, its smoke funneled out through a crafted vent. Around the birthing woman, two others move with practiced ease. One massages her back with oil pressed from nuts. Another checks the tension in the cord, binding her wrist, a ritual gesture thought to ease labor. It's speculative, of course, but in several sites across Eurasia, archaeologists have found female skeletons buried in postures that suggest support during labor, knees bent, pelvis tilted. More curious still are the objects found near these burials. Smooth stones rubbed down by hand, fossil shells tucked beneath the ribs, and in one case, a carved figure of a woman in labor, her swollen belly etched with spirals. Were these tokens of comfort, talismans of protection, or instructions passed from elder to apprentice? Researchers remain divided. Some argue the placement is symbolic death as mirror to birth. Others believe these women may have served as midwives or healers' roles rooted in shared memory rather than status. Either way, it paints a portrait not of isolation, but of a network. And networks leave marks. One grave in what is now Czechia revealed an elderly woman buried with the bones of infants nestled beside her. They weren't her children. The spacing and stratigraphy suggest she helped deliver them, perhaps over decades. Nearby clusters of medicinal herbs, mugwort, juniper, yarrow were discovered. Not random growth, purposeful collection. Imagine the sounds low humming shared, breathing the occasional laugh, breaking tension. These were not surgical procedures, but communal events, a circle drawn against mortality. Of course, childbirth was still perilous. Infant remains are common in prehistoric digs. So are the skeletal echoes of trauma, infection, hemorrhage. But what's emerging now is the picture of response. Not just grief, but preparation. Burial positions that suggest care. Herbal residues that point to attempted healing. Traces of compresses made from plant fiber and hide. One particularly touching find, a flint knife dulled from overuse buried next to a woman's rib cage. Some believe it was used for cutting umbilical cords again and again until her own cord ran out. So next time you picture a Paleolithic camp, don't just imagine spears and smoke. Think of the hands that caught new life, that knew when to press, when to wait, and when to whisper, "You're safe." It starts with a glint. Not from sunlight, but from a bead of carved bone dangling just above the collarbone of a woman seated by the fire. She's not royalty, not a warrior, but she gleams all the same. Across Paleolithic sites, buried beneath soot, and stone archaeologists keep finding clues that whisper of beauty adornment and a desire to dazzle. Cave women, it turns out, were makers of more than tools and shelter. They were jewelers. You run your fingers along a delicate strand of what once was a necklace, now a crumbling string of polished teeth, tiny shells, and bits of amber. It's easy to forget, but these items didn't serve a survival function. They didn't trap food, carry water, or defend a tribe. So why did they exist? Because someone cared about meaning, and perhaps about looking just a little fabulous while grinding wild roots. Throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia, early burial sites frequently include personal ornaments, especially in female graves. And some children are laid to rest with beads stitched into their clothing. In others, adult women wear headdresses strung with feathers or copper discs, their wrists lined with armlets fashioned from ivory. These were not anomalies. They were statements. At one Magdalenian site in France, hundreds of tiny beads made from fox teeth were uncovered, each painstakingly bored through by hand. The time and effort required is staggering. Researchers suggest it may have taken over 30 hours to produce a single strand. That's not casual decor. That's devotion. So who made these things? The same hands that tanned hides and stirred stews. Ethnographic parallels from more recent foraging societies indicate that women often took the lead in body decoration, not just for themselves, but for their families, especially children. Paint beads, braided hair, tattooing. These weren't luxuries. They were identity. And here's the quirky part. Some beads show signs of wear in odd places as if they were chewed on. Were they toys, teething tools, or simply comfort objects worn close to the skin? Nobody knows. But their presence suggests these weren't stiff ceremonial garb. These were lived-in, cherished, perhaps passed down across generations. Debates continue over the meaning. Were these trinkets symbols of clan marriage status? Did a necklace of wolf claws suggest hunting prowess? Did a belt of shells whisper of fertility or journey? There's no scholarly consensus. But what emerges is a broader picture of cave life, one that included not just survival, but style. Some researchers argue that such ornaments may even represent the earliest forms of currency objects traded gifted or used in negotiations. Others see them as memory keepers, each bead a story, each pendant a person. And it's entirely plausible that the people crafting them were also the keepers of oral histories, songs, and seasonal lore. So as you picture that smoky cave and the flicker of firelight across ancient stone, add a shimmer, a glint, a jingle perhaps. Jewelry in the Paleolithic wasn't just about beauty. It was about being seen, remembered, and celebrated. And many of those first jewelers, they likely answered to names lost in time. But their sparkle lingers. Step beyond the fire ring, past the racks of drying meat, and the scatter of shells, and you'll find something curious. A neat cluster of plants, too orderly, too close together to be wild. Some are herbs, others food-bearing. All of them growing just outside the cave entrance. Coincidence? Maybe. But archaeologists are starting to whisper a different theory. What if Paleolithic women were the first gardeners? It's not rows of corn or fenced-in beds, not yet. But the signs are there. Concentrations of edible and medicinal plants near living sites, often the same species again and again. They pop up in places where they shouldn't, on soil that shouldn't support them, and always in close proximity to human activity. It's not farming, but it's not exactly foraging either. You crouch beside one such patch, a dusty smear of soil, long dry, but still whispering secrets. Analysis shows high phosphate levels from decomposed organic matter plus trace signs of root disruption at regular intervals. Someone was digging here, not just walking through, deliberately, repeatedly. And who was doing the digging? Clues point again to women. In modern foraging groups, women often handle plant knowledge: what heals, what poisons, what thrives. It's not just picking and chewing. It's storing, soaking, replanting, even transplanting. This knowledge doesn't come from textbooks. It's carried in conversations, rituals, and the slow rhythm of seasonal memory. Some scholars propose the term proto-gardens for these Paleolithic patches. The idea is still debated. Was this passive encouragement, like dropping seeds in a favorable spot, or something more intentional? Did early humans recognize that seeds grew better near hearths and latrines, or that yanking up one root without damaging another helped new shoots thrive? There's no consensus, but the possibility is reshaping how we think about early food systems. Far from being passive gatherers, these women might have been experimentalists, testing, tweaking, nudging nature into partnership. One site in Israel revealed clusters of wild legumes growing unusually close together with seed remnants found in adjacent hearths. In another, in Ukraine, researchers found lined depressions in the ground containing tuber residue, suggesting controlled planting or storage pits. Not accidental, not random. And then there's the aesthetic layer. Some plant remnants had no known edible or medicinal value. They were fragrant, bright, or simply unusual. Were they gathered for beauty, for ritual, or to mark space as theirs? The idea of women shaping not just sustenance, but the very landscape around them, softly, slowly, and with intention, is hard to ignore. Imagine her now, kneeling in the morning light, fingers smudged with earth, humming to herself as she presses a seed into softened soil. She doesn't think of herself as a revolutionary, but she's bending the future just a little closer to comfort. One quirky theory suggests that these early garden spaces doubled as teaching grounds where elders showed children which leaf to chew, which stem to avoid. A living classroom, growing lesson by lesson. So the next time someone tells you, farming began with men, and plows, remind them before the plow came the patch. And maybe, just maybe, a cave woman with a handful of seeds and a wild idea. You find yourself deep in the back chamber of the cave now, where the walls narrow and the air turns thick with silence. No flickering bison here, no handprints or hearth smoke, just symbols, spirals, dots, lines, and at the very center, a figure rendered in red, ochre-tall arms raised surrounded by antlers. Was she a spirit, a memory, or a woman in ritual? Some scholars believe Paleolithic women weren't just caretakers of the hearth, but leaders of the sacred. It's a hypothesis both tantalizing and contested. Across continents, archaeologists have uncovered traces of female-centric spirituality. At first glance, it's tempting to leap toward goddess cultures, grand matriarchal societies, ruled by priestesses and moon calendars. But the truth, as always, is murkier. What we do know is this: women's remains are often found buried with items that suggest ritual knowledge: shells, stones, pigments, beads. And in some cases, those women were laid to rest in positions of honor, their graves deeper, their trappings richer. Take the burial at Dolní Věstonice in what is now the Czech Republic. There, a woman in her 40s was found with a fox's jaw placed beside her mammoth ivory beads at her hip and a carved figure tucked under her arm. Not a mother's grave, a memory keeper's. Some scholars suggest that certain cave chambers were reserved for rituals led by women spaces where the tribe might gather not for sleep, but for storytelling, for ceremony, or for guidance. The acoustics in these chambers are extraordinary voices echo, even whispering creates resonance. And it's possible that these soundscapes were used deliberately to heighten mood, to mark significance. You can almost hear it, the low chant, the rustle of feathers, the clack of a rattle made from hollow bone. A woman steps forward, face painted in spirals, fingers dusted with ash. She's not just performing, she's remembering for the group and for those yet to come. In some traditions, still practiced by indigenous communities today, women serve as story bearers, holding lineages of song, myth, and moral codes. It's a role not of domination, but of transmission. Some archaeologists believe Paleolithic women filled similar positions, moving between child rearing and spirit tending with equal grace. The idea remains controversial. Some argue the evidence is circumstantial, the interpretations too generous. Others counter that we've simply been too eager for too long to imagine men as the only storytellers, the only shamans, the only important ones. And then there are the figurines, the so-called Venus statues, curvaceous, abstracted female forms, carved from stone bone or ivory. Some believe these were fertility totems. Others see them as symbols of female wisdom, or even self-portraits. A few have been found in caves, near hearths, or ritual spaces, suggesting they were more than art, they were icons. Whether as spiritual leaders, or simply as keepers of tradition, cave women seem to have held roles that touched not just the body, but the soul. And in a world shaped by survival, that kind of presence, soft, steady, sacred, may have been the most vital of all. At the far end of a burial site, beneath a low overhang, crusted with centuries of soot, lies a skeleton. The bones are weathered, but arranged with care. One hand curls around a stone blade, the other rests atop a necklace of bone beads. This was not a forgotten body. This was a ceremony. And the person at the center, an elderly woman laid to rest with dignity, objects, and perhaps reverence. For decades, scholars focused on male burials when discussing honor legacy or leadership. But increasingly, the graves of older women are telling a richer tale of wisdom, of status, and of roles that stretch far beyond reproduction. You lean in closer to the skeleton. Her teeth are worn, flat sign of age and of work. But there's more. Her joints are polished smooth, likely from repeated motions like grinding or weaving. These were not idle hands. They earned their rest, and surrounding her are signs that she wasn't just mourned, she was memorialized. Across Eurasia, female burials from the Upper Paleolithic to the early Neolithic have revealed fascinating patterns. Tools once assumed to be masculine, like awl scrapers, and even projectile points, are found tucked near women's hips. In one Croatian cave, an elderly woman was buried with a toolkit so complete it rivaled that of any known male hunter. Alongside it, a small pouch of red ochre and a carved ivory pendant shaped like a bird. What does it mean? Some suggest these women held special knowledge of plants, of craft of healing. Others propose they acted as elders, decision-makers, or clan memory keepers. It's not just theory. Ethnographic studies of modern forager groups reveal similar dynamics. Older women often serve as advisors, midwives, and story holders. When they die, the community feels a whole, not just of affection, but of knowledge. A peculiar discovery adds another layer. In a Siberian burial site, a woman in her 70s was interred beside a young girl, likely her granddaughter. Between them lay a polished bone flute, its holes worn soft from decades of use. Had she taught the girl to play, or had the girl played it for her in her final days? No one knows. But the placement feels tender, intentional. And then there's the matter of grave goods. Some graves include not just tools, but decorative items, beads, shells, etched stones. These weren't necessities. They were tokens, possibly gifts. In one Spanish cave, a woman was buried with 2 feather fans and a lump of resin-scented bark, a cosmetic kit, a ritual object. The ambiguity remains, but the care speaks volumes. Scholars continue to debate how far these roles extended. Were these women clan leaders? Did they hold spiritual authority? Or were they simply beloved matriarchs whose long lives merited a deeper farewell? Whatever the answer, the bones speak, and what they say softly, through the language of placement, object, and posture, is that age did not equal invisibility. In fact, for some Paleolithic women, age may have been their most honored season. The walls echo not with speech, but with laughter, light, shrill, familiar. A child darts past you, barefoot, smudged with soot, trailing behind a string of dried grasses knotted like a toy. In the world of caves and cold stone, childhood was not a separate realm. It was threaded directly into the rhythms of daily life. And behind that rhythm, often a woman watching, teaching, guiding. Step into the cave's communal chamber, and you'll see signs of their presence, tiny handprints alongside larger ones, short footprints pressed into clay floors, and bits of flint shaped too crudely to be tools, perhaps practice pieces discarded in frustration or pride. Children lived here, and they learned here. From whom? Most evidence points to mothers, grandmothers, or older sisters, those who stayed near the hearth, who gathered plants and tended fire. But their role wasn't merely functional. It was emotional, social. They shaped the youngest minds not with discipline, but with repetition, song, and gesture. In one French cave, archaeologists uncovered a circle of smoothed stones arranged around a shallow fire pit. Among the ashes, small animal figurines carved from bone, some broken, some soot-stained. Were these toys, teaching aids, or offerings from small hands, trying to mimic adult rituals? Whatever their use, they suggest that learning began not in lectures, but in play. Cave art supports this too. Some stencils appear to be made by children, hands barely larger than a sparrow. Others show irregular lines, scribbles over older paintings, or awkward versions of animal forms. These weren't graffiti. They were practice, and likely tolerated, perhaps even celebrated by the adults nearby. You imagine a girl crouched beside her mother, mimicking her movements as she grinds pigment or weaves fiber. Every motion is a lesson. Every correction, a memory being planted. There's no classroom, just the steady hum of repetition softened by touch and warmth. Some scholars argue that women served as the first teachers, not in a formal sense, but through presence. Their tasks gathering herbs, cooking, crafting offered natural opportunities for instruction. And because these roles happened near the hearth, the learning environment was intimate, predictable, safe, and quirky. In one site, researchers found a series of intentionally placed pebbles leading from a sleeping alcove to a hearth, each painted with a different symbol. A prehistoric board game, a counting system, or simply a child's private ritual assembled with gentle guidance. It's unclear. But it tells us this imagination lived here. Debate remains about how structured this education was. Did tribes have designated storytellers? Were myths taught at certain ages? There's no consensus. But the rhythms of fire-tending, food preparation, and daily chores created a curriculum all their own. So the next time you picture early humans grunting over raw meat, remember the other scene, a woman humming softly while tying a knot, a child beside her, doing the same, badly, adorably, persistently. Learning not just how to survive, but how to belong. In those dim corners of ancient caves, childhood wasn't separate from culture. It was culture's seed growing under the watchful eyes of women who knew stories start young. A gentle crackle stirs the silence, followed by a burst of smoke, curling upward and vanishing into the dim air. Fire in the Paleolithic wasn't just a flickering light, it was a feat of control. And behind many of those quiet blazes were women who didn't just tend flames, they engineered them. If you've ever tried to light damp wood in a breeze, you already know fire doesn't cooperate without expertise. You crouch near the hearth, watching as a woman carefully arranges her fuel. First dry moss, then birch bark curled just so, then kindling. The logs she selects aren't random, some for heat, some for long, burn, some for smoke. And the way she stacks them, not high like a bonfire, but low and tight to feed the cave's warmth without choking the air. For too long, fire tending was imagined as passive something done by women while the men hunted. But recent studies are pushing back, showing that fire maintenance was complex, even scientific. Airflow had to be managed, ash had to be displaced. Coals needed banking to smolder through the night. At a site in Israel, dating back over 300,000 years, researchers found multiple hearths arranged in semicircles clearly planned for heat dispersion. Some burned hotter than others, suggesting different wood types and purposes: cooking, heating, smoking meat, or hides. Each task required a different method and someone who knew what she was doing. In some caves, smoke traces on the ceiling form uneven patterns, evidence of constructed air vents or directional airflow. It wasn't architecture exactly, but it was spatial planning. Women likely memorized wind patterns, cave drafts, and wood behaviors like a mental map. And then there's the fuel. You don't just burn any log you find. Wet wood smokes. Resinous wood stinks. Dung burns low, but stably. In some sites, traces of peat and bone ash appear alternative fuels selected for specific reasons. Gathering and storing these required knowledge, trial and error, and often cooperation. One odd but delightful clue. Bundles of herbs, sage thyme yarrow, have been found singed near hearths. Were they used to season food scent the air or repel insects? Possibly all three. But some researchers speculate they served as fire notes, quick-burning triggers tucked under moss to coax a spark to life. Practical, yes, but also a little poetic. Scholars still debate how fire roles were assigned. Was it strictly gendered, or based on skill age or time of year? Some suggest that older women no longer tied to childbearing, specialized in fire, keeping it alive, managing it for different tasks, teaching others. And those smoky ceilings. They served as early ventilation diagrams drawn in soot, adjusted with each burn. Not consciously artistic, perhaps, but undeniably technical. So next time someone says, "She just kept the fire going," smile. That's not just. That's chemistry, physics, meteorology, and memory all rolled into one flame. In a world of cold nights and unpredictable hunts, the person who controlled fire controlled comfort food, protection, even storytelling. And often, that person was a woman with smoke-stained hands and a long mental ledger of what burns best, when, and why. A quiet gathering forms beneath a canopy of bone and hide not for battle or birth, but for decision. In the circle sit elders, a few hunters, and at least two women who speak without raising their voices. There are no thrones, no crowns, just fur-lined seats, a shared fire, and an ongoing mystery who led the clan. And how could it be that in some Paleolithic societies, power passed through the mother's line? Enter the matriarch theories, fascinating, controversial, and still under excavation. You settle near the fire as the discussion unfolds, not in shouts, but in storytelling. Leadership here isn't about dominance, it's about memory, wisdom, and presence. In some burial sites, archaeologists have uncovered patterns suggesting matrilineal descent, where property identity, or even leadership, flowed through the female side. The evidence is subtle but intriguing. Take the site at Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey. Though slightly later than the Paleolithic, its structures and graves hint at a culture where men and women held comparable status. Burial clustering often follows the maternal line. Rooms were decorated with female imagery, not of war or conquest, but of fertility, memory, and protection. Some scholars argue this reflects a broader, older tradition rooted in Ice Age practices. One of the quirkiest clues comes from mitochondrial DNA. Because it's passed solely through mothers, researchers use it to track lineage. And in several cave burial sites, related individuals appear to be clustered matrilineally. This doesn't prove governance, but it suggests that maternal relationships matter deeply, perhaps more so than paternal ones. Still, the theory has skeptics. Some argue that these patterns could reflect living arrangements, not leadership. Others say it's dangerous to project modern ideas of gender or power onto prehistoric people. And they're right to be cautious. But even caution doesn't erase the bones. One poignant find comes from a Siberian site where 3 generations of women were buried head to toe in a shared grave. Between them lay carved stone tools and ceremonial objects suggesting not only continuity, but legacy. The arrangement implies that they weren't just family, they were founders. Picture the matriarch not towering, not commanding, but central. She's the one people approach to settle disputes. She knows which berries turn bitter in spring. She remembers the way the wind shifts before the animals move. Her power doesn't come from force, but from depth of knowledge, of memory, of years lived and seen. In some ethnographic parallels, matrilineal societies tend to emphasize consensus, balance, and cooperation over hierarchy. Decisions aren't made in haste, but through long conversations often shaped by those who've raised the most children, told the most stories, or buried the most kin. Does this mean every Paleolithic group followed such models? No. But the idea that some did that leadership could look like care instead of conquest is worth considering. So next time someone conjures up caveman chiefs barking orders from atop a boulder, offer a gentler image, a woman seated by the fire eyes, wise hands still speaking, in a voice so steady it shapes the entire tribe. The cave walls are still the embers low. Outside, the wind scratches across stone, as if searching for a voice long buried. You walk slowly, now past the handprints, the beads, the bundles of herbs. Everything you've seen, every flicker of woman's work and wonder has one thing in common: it was forgotten. Not erased exactly, but overwritten. Scrubbed from textbooks, dismissed as decoration, waved away by dusty men in dusty coats. This section is not about bones. It's about bias. In the 19th century, archaeology was still a gentleman's pastime, often more romantic than rigorous. Caves were entered with a lantern and a theory already in mind that men hunted, invented, painted, and led, while women bore children and stirred something near a fire. Every tool was labeled his. Every burial with beads was presumed symbolic. Every absence of a spear point, proof of lesser importance. You lean into a stack of faded field notes from an 1870s dig. A small handprint is marked likely juvenile male. The same print today, reanalyzed with finger ratio studies, would likely be female. But back then, no one asked. The past, they believed, mirrored the present, or rather their present. And their present didn't imagine women shaping anything except stew. It wasn't until the late 20th century that things began to shift. Female archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians started revisiting the same sites, the same bones, the same pigments, with different questions. What if that all wasn't ceremonial, but a well-used tool? What if those herbs weren't burial decor, but medicine? What if that cave woman had a name? Re-examinations began to pile up. Childbirth burials were recognized as medical evidence. Pigment caches hinted at complex botanical knowledge. Jewelry making was reframed as technological precision. Slowly, the cave woman stepped out of caricature and into curiosity. Still, the work is far from done. Even today, gender assumptions linger in how we interpret remains. A pelvis too narrow must be male. Buried with weapons, definitely male. Buried with beads, ritual. With fiber tools, domestic. The filters persist. But the whispers of the women who lived those lives, who crafted, hunted, healed, taught, led, remembered, have grown louder. Not from new discoveries alone, but from new lenses, new minds willing to question the convenient myths. One quirky example. In a major exhibit in the early 2000s, a famous reconstruction of a caveman artist was later corrected to possibly female after deeper pigment analysis and skull reassessment. The museum changed the plaque. The figure stayed the same bearded broad male. Progress partially paused. Scholars now argue for gender-neutral archaeology, where artifacts are interpreted based on context, not expectation. But even neutrality is radical when so much forgetting has been framed as fact. So as you step out of the cave and into the starlit silence, remember this. The absence of a name doesn't mean the absence of a legacy. And sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones told not with certainty, but with curiosity. She was here. She lit fires. She raised children. She made tools. She painted. She passed down songs. She mattered. And just when you think the cave has fallen quiet, another torch flickers to life, this time aimed not at discovery, but at undoing assumptions baked into the stone. Imagine a cave. Not a cold, dripping one, but a quiet sanctuary, smoky with hearth fire walls warm to the touch. On those curved stone walls, shadowy figures chased deer with spears. For decades, these scenes were interpreted as heroic male hunts, proving prehistoric men were brave, aggressive providers. The women, they were assumed to be home, doing something less cinematic. This belief wasn't based on hard evidence. It was based on what Victorian men thought made sense. The theory felt natural to them. Of course men hunted. Of course men painted themselves doing it. Their assumptions became our inherited narrative. But the truth is messier and much more interesting. In the 1960s, archaeologists began to notice details that didn't quite fit. Some of the hunters had short statures. Others bore hips too wide to be male. Still others weren't hunters at all. They held staffs or rattles or wore elaborate costumes. One cave in France depicted what looked like a hunting scene until infrared scans showed a second figure had been painted first, then partially covered. That earlier figure not holding a weapon at all. Possibly dancing. Possibly giving birth. Scholars now debate whether we ever saw these hunters clearly in the first place. Some propose they were ritual actors, part of ceremonies, not actual warriors. Others suggest that painting was a community effort, children included, where symbolism mattered more than literal accuracy. Perhaps it was never about who did the hunting, but who got remembered on the wall. And so we begin to ask, what stories did we erase by assuming the first painter was a man with a spear? What roles went undocumented, not because they didn't exist, but because the observers didn't know how to see them? It's easy to miss nuance when you're holding a torch and looking for yourself in the dark. In the stillness of the cave, handprints bloom like ghostly petals, splayed fingers pressed against the stone, ringed in ochre spray. At first glance, they seem like signatures, anonymous, yet universal. For decades, these prints were treated as decorative ritualistic traces left by proud male hunters. But with a measuring tape and a fresh question, researchers started to see something different. And suddenly, the walls began to whisper. Back in the early 2000s, an archaeologist named Dean Snow noticed something odd. The finger ratios on many of these ancient hand stencils didn't match those typically seen in men. On average, male index fingers are shorter relative to their ring fingers. But these cave prints showed the opposite: longer index fingers, narrower palms. In site after site, France, Spain, Indonesia, the same patterns emerged. Statistically speaking, a large number of these prints were made by women. Of course, not every print yields a clear answer. Erosion overlap and natural variation make perfect certainty impossible. Some scholars caution against over-interpreting the data, arguing that hormone levels, population genetics, or even the age of the printmaker could skew results. But even with those uncertainties, the evidence leans toward a more balanced cast of cave artists than previously imagined. This challenges a long-standing trope, the rugged male artist pausing between kills to record his greatness in ochre. A different image emerges now, a community where women painted too, perhaps leading the art, teaching the technique, or marking territory in ways we're only beginning to grasp. Some researchers even suggest the handprints were a form of communication, part of a visual language passed down through generations. And there's something deeply intimate about those prints. Unlike a carved spear or painted bison, the hand is a direct imprint of self-alive, reaching personal. It says, I was here, and now perhaps I am her. You picture her crouched, low, lips full of red pigment cheeks smudged with ash. She presses her hand against the cave wall, blows carefully through a hollowed bone, and leaves behind not just a print, but a presence. Then she fades into the smoke, never knowing that her gesture would be misread for centuries. It's a quiet act of rebellion, echoing through time. Some believe the prints may also signify roles or rites of passage initiation, childbirth, or mourning. Others argue they were territorial, a visual you are entering our space. Still others think they were just art, expression for its own sake. The scholarly consensus, there isn't one, which makes these traces all the more compelling. Once thought mere decoration, these handprints now stand as evidence of lives unseen. They challenge our assumptions and stretch our imagination beyond familiar stories. The cave, it turns out, isn't a gallery of men. It's a layered record of humanity. So next time you see a red handprint on stone, consider who reached for that wall. It may not be the hunter you expected, and maybe that's the point. In the dim light of the cave, red ochre glows like embers. It smears across stone in careful arcs. Dots and spirals patterns once dismissed as primitive doodles or idle decoration. For generations, these colored shapes were seen as aesthetic fluff background noise to the real images of animals and spears. But as the pigments were re-examined, a question emerged. What if the colors and symbols were trying to say something? Ochre ranging from rusty reds to yellow browns wasn't just pretty, it had meaning. Ancient humans used it to mark objects' bodies in sacred places. They ground it into powder, mixed it with fat or water, and carried it in pouches. It wasn't easy to obtain, either some ochre came from mines dozens of miles away, suggesting it held value beyond mere adornment. And then there were the patterns. Lines radiating like suns, repeating chevrons, spirals nested like fingerprints. To early archaeologists, these meant little. But to linguists, cognitive scientists, and modern indigenous artists, they look familiar. Some resemble proto-writing, the earliest flickers of symbolic communication. Others might map animal migration seasons or celestial events. In fact, one particularly intriguing theory links the placement of ochre symbols to acoustics. In certain caves, the red marks appear in spots where echoes are strongest. Researchers banged drums, clapped hands, and the sound carried differently in marked zones. Some suggest these were ceremonial sound chambers where ritual and resonance met. Others propose they marked places of spiritual or narrative importance, oral signposts, for gatherings, stories, or songs. Still, not everyone agrees. Some scholars warn against romanticizing ochre. Perhaps it was used purely for visibility in torchlight, or just followed aesthetic preferences. The pigments fade after all. Intentions don't fossilize. Interpretation like the ochre must be gently brushed from layers of assumption. What's clearer now is that these marks weren't meaningless. In one cave, a red spiral overlays an animal's heart. In another, dots form a winding path between figures. And in a lesser-known chamber, ochre symbols appear to radiate from a central form, possibly a shamanic figure, or simply a storyteller. These discoveries push us to reevaluate how we define communication. Words are just one form. So are images. But so too is rhythm, repetition, color, and form. What seems decorative to us may have conveyed time, danger, kinship, or dreams. Imagine crouching beside the wall as someone smears a stripe of crimson across stone. You don't know their name, but you know they paused mixed pigment by firelight and decided to mark this spot for someone else to see. That someone is you. There's something soothing in that, the idea that 30,000 years ago, someone tried to send a message across time, not with words, but with color. A red line, a curve, a burst of ochre dots. We may never decipher the full grammar of that language, but the conversation is ongoing, and the wall is still speaking. Not every misunderstanding begins in a cave. Some start in drawing rooms lined with velvet drapes, where Victorian scholars sip tea and theorize about prehistory without ever stepping into the damp silence of ancient stone. This was the world that shaped the early narratives of man, the hunter, and woman, the gatherer. But it wasn't just academic, it was deeply cultural. And as it turns out, those cozy British parlors left their fingerprints on prehistory. By the late 19th century, anthropology was booming. Wealthy men, mostly European, were funding expeditions collecting bones and interpreting them through a distinctly Victorian lens. Gender roles were rigid. Masculinity meant activity, dominance, provision. Femininity meant passivity, nurture, and domesticity. So when these gentlemen looked at stone tools or cave scenes, they didn't just see artifacts. They saw their own society reflected back. The image of the female gatherer, for instance, became a kind of placeholder. Someone needed to be home while men chased mammoths. Never mind that gathering statistically provided the bulk of prehistoric diets, or that it required knowledge of ecology, seasonal migration, and plant pharmacology. In their minds, the gatherer was helper, not hero. It didn't help that evidence of women's work was harder to preserve. Nets, baskets, textiles all degraded over time. Spears and bones didn't. The visible record seemed to favor men, and so the invisible roles were ignored. Historians simply filled the gaps with what they knew the world of the drawing room, not the cave. Some scholars today call this retrospective projection, the tendency to map current ideologies onto ancient people. Others label it androcentric bias. Regardless of terminology, the result was the same: prehistory was gendered from the start. And that's not just an academic problem. It shaped museum displays, textbooks, even films. The image of the grunting male hunter dragging home meat while a passive female tended the fire became cultural shorthand, but it was never proven. It was simply assumed. When researchers in the 1970s began to re-examine this, they were often dismissed. Feminist archaeology was treated as a political movement, not a scientific correction. Yet over time, more inclusive methods like isotopic analysis of bones or microwear studies of tools began to reveal complexity. Women had calluses on their hands. They carried loads-shaped weapons, and in some cases were buried with hunting gear. Still, the old myths die slowly. Imagine a scene, not in a cave, but in a parlor. A man in a waistcoat holds a flint blade between gloved fingers. He declares it a warrior's tool meant for a man. He jots this theory in a leather notebook. Decades later, that theory becomes curriculum. And in that moment, the gatherer becomes secondary and visible, pushed off stage in the drama of prehistory. But maybe she was there all along, just quiet, efficient, and misunderstood. The cave tells one story. The drawing room told another. And somewhere between the two lies a history waiting to be remembered, not rewritten, but reread. A figure stands at the back of a painted chamber, arms raised, cloaked in something that looks like feathers or stitched leaves. For decades, this image was labeled the shaman, a spiritual man, communing with otherworldly forces. He had to be male, scholars said, because he appeared powerful. The costume, clearly ritual garb. But a few cautious voices have begun to ask, what if the interpretation was all wrong? What if the figure wasn't a shaman at all, but a seamstress? This suggestion isn't as wild as it sounds. The assumption that elaborate clothing signifies religious leadership is a relatively modern invention. In earlier societies, intricate garments were often tied to skilled craftsmanship or high status unrelated to spiritual roles. And among the many jobs in a prehistoric community, someone had to make the clothes. In some cave images, you can see thread-like lines trailing from shoulders, zigzag motifs near the waist, or headpieces resembling woven bands. These details, long considered symbolic or magical, could just as easily indicate textiles. But early archaeologists, mostly male and untrained in textile arts, had little framework to imagine a seamstress standing where they expected a shaman. Add to this the historic undervaluing of so-called women's work. Weaving, sewing, tanning hides these essential skills often went unrecognized in archaeological interpretation. While the spear was seen as noble, the needle was ignored. And so, a figure in ornate dress must surely be a mystic man, not a maker of things. But recent discoveries complicate that view. At some burial sites, women have been found interred with sewing tools, dye fragments, and even beads still threaded on sinew. In one case, microscopic analysis of a tunic fragment revealed dye patterns that mirrored symbols from a nearby cave wall, suggesting that clothing itself might have been used to convey stories, status, or identity. There is no consensus. Some researchers still argue for spiritual meanings pointing to trance postures or animal motifs. Others propose dual roles, craftswomen who also held ceremonial power. And some urge caution, reminding us that we may be seeing what we expect, not what is. But imagine this: a woman hunched by the fire stitching hide into a cloak of feathered sleeves. Her fingers move with practiced rhythm. She hums a melody passed down from her mother. That night, she dons the cloak and steps into the cave not as a mystic, but as a maker. And someone paints her. That image endures. Thousands of years later, someone else stares at the painting and decides that must be a shaman. It's a curious thing how interpretation travels farther than pigment. So the next time you glimpse an ancient figure in strange garb, ask yourself, who made that garment? Who wore it? And why was it costume or clothing, performance or profession? Because sometimes the sacred and the sewn are not so different. And sometimes the woman behind the needle is the one who shaped the scene. A tiny sculpture no taller than your hand lies cradled in the soil, rounded hips, full breasts, no feet, no face. The Venus figurine, they call her. And for over a century, she's been cast as one thing: a fertility idol, a prehistoric goddess, a symbol of motherhood, sexuality, abundance. But as always, the question looms: did the people who made her see her that way? Or is this again our own story, masquerading as theirs? Dozens of these so-called Venus figurines have been found across Europe and parts of Asia. They vary in shape and detail, but many share common traits: exaggerated female forms, abstracted limbs, and often a distinct lack of facial features. Early male archaeologists interpreted them as totems of reproductive power, perhaps used in rituals to ensure healthy births or bountiful hunts. It was a tidy explanation. It also aligned neatly with Victorian obsessions over gender, sex, and the mystical role of womanhood. But cracks in that theory have begun to show. For one, the figurines aren't found in shrines or ceremonial pits. Many were discovered in domestic settings near hearths or communal spaces. Others were carried far from their place of origin, tucked into satchels passed along trade routes. Some even wear patterns that suggest they were handled frequently, not stored like sacred relics. New theories have emerged. Some scholars propose they were teaching tools used to instruct young people about the human body. Others believe they were self-portraits, early expressions of identity, memory, or pride. Still others think they served as status symbols, carried by skilled artisans or matriarchal leaders. The truth, no one knows for certain. And then there's the name Venus. It was coined in the 19th century as a joke referencing the Roman goddess of love to describe what some saw as primitive porn. That label stuck, influencing generations of interpretation. But calling them Venus imposes a very specific lens, one rooted in classical mythology, European art, and modern gender politics. Some researchers now argue that these figures deserve a new name, one free from connotations of eroticism or motherhood. Maybe they're stone women, or the remembered. Or maybe we don't name them at all, we just listen. Imagine one of these figures sitting in a palm 25,000 years ago, freshly carved. A young girl studies its curves, not with shame or reverence, but with curiosity. She adds a line, perhaps a necklace. She doesn't call it Venus. She calls it familiar. And just like that, the figure becomes more than an object, it becomes a mirror. Not every figure is the same. Some have intricate hair patterns. Others appear pregnant or aged or draped in patterns. This variety hints at individuality, not archetype. And yet, history clung tightly to one idea that they must be about birth, about men's hope for lineage, about women's function, not their presence. But maybe they weren't symbols of fertility. Maybe they were symbols of being seen. And in that, they still are. The flint blade sits snug in a calloused hand, its edge chipped just right, ready to slice hide or scrape bark. For years, archaeologists who unearthed such tools assumed their users were male. After all, tool making was advanced technical associated with hunting. And women, they reasoned, were too busy gathering or caring for children to shape stone. But dig a little deeper, literally, and fingerprints begin to contradict that tidy tale. Microscopic analysis of ancient tools has revealed fine traces of skin oils, wear patterns, and even fingerprints. And when those prints are analyzed just like the hand stencils in caves, many skew female. Some show the proportions typical of adolescent girls. Others suggest adult women who not only use these tools, but likely made them. This rewrites an entire aspect of prehistory. Tool production wasn't a male monopoly. In some cultures, it may have been communal. In others, passed down mother to daughter. Yet for decades, museum plaques credited early man with every flint bone awl or hammerstone. Some archaeologists chalk this up to invisible labor bias, the tendency to overlook or undervalue tasks typically done by women. Tool use was only seen as significant when it fit into a narrative of war or hunting. Scraping hides, trimming sinew that was domestic work, lesser, even when the tools were identical. One particularly revealing case involved a Neanderthal burial site. A set of flint tools was found alongside beads and a carefully folded fur pelt. Initial reports described the tools as a hunter's kit, but isotopic analysis later revealed the skeleton belonged to a woman. She ate a varied diet, showed signs of physical labor, and had the same kinds of healed injuries often associated with hunting. So was she a hunter, a tanner, a healer, who needed sharp tools? The truth is probably all of the above. Roles weren't fixed in prehistory. Flexibility was survival. Still, some scholars resist these reinterpretations. They argue that without written records, it's speculative to assign gendered roles at all. Others fear that modern politics are shaping research agendas. But even cautious voices agree the assumption that all tool users were male doesn't hold. And really, why should it? Imagine a group around a fire sharing stories while shaping flint. A girl tries her hand, laughs at the first uneven chip, and is gently corrected by an older cousin herself, a skilled napper. The girl practices again. Flint clinks softly, and over time, her hands learn the rhythm. One day, her tools will be found in the ground, and for a while, someone will call them his, until they don't. This isn't about replacing one myth with another. It's about letting the evidence speak, even when it whispers against our expectations. Women shape tools. That much is clear. And their prints faint but firm remain. They were never absent, just overlooked. There's a trick the cave plays, one that hides its secrets in plain sight. You walk past a familiar painting torchlight, bouncing off the walls, and think you've seen it all. A line of bison, a lone hunter, the usual suspects. But then with a filter of infrared or a beam of multispectral light, the wall changes. Figures once thought complete now reveal layers beneath shapes, symbols sometimes entire scenes that had vanished into darkness. The cave remembers more than we knew. In recent decades, advances in imaging technology have transformed how we view prehistoric art. Infrared scanning, ultraviolet fluorescence, and 3D photogrammetry allow researchers to peer beneath centuries of soot calcite deposits and fading pigments. And what they're finding is unexpected. In one cave, what appeared to be a solitary horse turned out to be part of a procession half a dozen animals, and beside them, a human figure previously invisible to the naked eye. In another, a set of random red lines resolved into a detailed hunting scene, complete with spears, footprints, and an unknown quadruped. But the revelations don't end with animals. In some cases, human figures once assumed male based on the crude outlines now show hips, braids, or body shapes more consistent with female forms. Scholars debate these identifications, of course. Stylization varies wildly across sites. Still, the evidence has forced a reckoning. Some of these forgotten figures appear to be storytellers. In one illuminated panel, a central figure raises their hands surrounded by abstract symbols like a constellation mapped in ochre. Nearby, smaller human forms cluster their gestures, almost playful. The scene might be a gathering, a dance, or a teaching moment, or something else entirely. The ambiguity lingers. Then there are the ghost painting scenes that were partially scraped away, painted over, or left unfinished. These ghostly remnants suggest that cave art wasn't static. It evolved, was revised, possibly even censored, which raises tantalizing questions: who decided what stayed, who got erased? One theory posits that these overpainted figures were part of a visual conversation spanning generations. Much like graffiti, layered in modern cities, each new mark responded to those before. Others believe certain images were only meant to be seen under specific conditions: torchlight angles, ceremonial firelight, or through hallucinogenic haze during trance states. And as always, scholarly opinions vary. Some caution against overreading these rediscoveries, warning that modern tools might introduce false positives, seeing patterns where none were intended. Yet even the skeptics agree the caves are not silent. They are palimpsests, texts overwritten, revealing deeper meaning when gently peeled back. You imagine standing there with your modern lens, sweeping it across the wall. A painted deer shimmers, and beside it a hand appears, open-reaching. You weren't supposed to see her, but you did. And maybe that's enough. Because every new detail, every forgotten figure, nudges us closer to understanding not just what early humans painted, but how they thought, remembered, and told stories worth illuminating. The hearth crackles softly in the dark, its glow licking the stone walls with flickers of orange. You picture a man tending the flames, meat roasting a spear propped nearby. That's the image we were given: the rugged provider, warming his tribe after a hard day's hunt. But in cave after cave, beneath the ash and charcoal, a quieter truth emerges. These fire pits weren't just about survival. They were engineered spaces, and many show signs of a different hand at work. For decades, archaeologists treated hearths as utilitarian a place to cook meat, ward off beasts, dry hides. Basic needs met by men. But recent excavations have revealed surprising complexity. Hearths weren't randomly built. They were carefully constructed, positioned to ventilate smoke-reflect light onto painted walls, and even regulate indoor temperatures. Some used layered stone, others incorporated clay basins to hold embers. These weren't crude campfires, they were designed environments. And here's where it gets interesting. The tools and traces found around these hearths often align more closely with traditionally female tasks: grinding stones, dye pots, bone awls, even early weaving implements. In one site, pollen analysis showed a variety of plant materials around a fire, some with medicinal properties. Another featured embedded shell beads, suggesting time spent sitting, crafting talking domestic work, but with its own form of mastery. Researchers now refer to these areas as social hearths, places of gathering, storytelling, care, and craft. And in many cases, they bear signs of female presence fingerprints on clay heel marks and compacted earth ochre residue from painted tools. Still, some resist this interpretation. A hearth, they argue, is a hearth, assigning gender risks, projecting modern roles backward. But as with so much of prehistoric life, the question isn't whether men or women did everything, it's who did what, where, and why we assumed otherwise. You picture her again, not a goddess or a cave diva, just someone focused, practiced shaping the fire with a piece of bone. She shifts a hot stone with tongs carved from antler. A toddler tugs at her wrap. Behind her, someone hums. The fire burns steady. We're beginning to see that prehistoric women weren't merely bystanders to history. They were engineers of comfort, designers of space. They created warmth, not just in temperature, but in community maintaining hearths that fed, healed, and held entire groups together. In some cases, hearth layouts mirrored the placement of art, deliberate sight lines, from firelight to painted figures. This suggests a layered awareness of ambiance, of mood, of how light would dance across the walls at just the right moment. That's not instinct. That's design. So the next time you imagine a fire flickering in the dark, don't stop at the hunter's shadow. Look closer. Look for the small hand stirring embers, the careful circle of stones, the soft groove in the floor from countless seated hours. That's a different kind of power, one we nearly missed, and it kept everyone warm. There's a squiggle scratched into the stone, just a line looping twice, then branching out like a river delta. For years, such markings were dismissed as doodles, not quite art, not quite writing. But when researchers overlaid dozens of these squiggles across maps of local terrain, they noticed something remarkable. The marks weren't random. They were routes, directions, calendars. And many may have been drawn by women who knew the land better than anyone else. In hunter-gatherer societies, mapping wasn't done with parchment and ink. It happened through songlines, memory trails, and etched marks that guided movement through complex environments. Women as primary gatherers often knew which plants bloomed, where water could be found, and how to track seasonal changes. Their mental maps weren't just survival tools, they were community knowledge, passed down, scratched in stone. Take the Blombos cave engravings in South Africa, dating back over 70,000 years. Crisscrossed grids and chevrons etched into ochre tablets, long considered symbolic, possibly spiritual. But some researchers now believe they represent topographical patterns. Coastal ridges, shellfish beds, pathways to seasonal harvests. Not unlike a grocery list you could never afford to lose. Closer to Europe and caves across Spain and France, similar symbols appear: dots and sequence lines near cave entrances, radiating arcs that correspond eerily with lunar phases. These marks were placed deliberately, often at eye level, for a crouched adult, occasionally clustered around hearths or resting spots. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some archaeologists hold that these were purely decorative or ritualistic. Others argue they reflect shared symbolic systems with no specific map-like intent. But the theory persists that what we once saw as scribbles may have been the first attempts to orient to say go this way or come back when the berries ripen. And if you listen to oral traditions of indigenous cultures, today many include map-making practices tied to women. In Australia, some Dreamtime paths are maintained through female songlines. In the Arctic Inuit, women charted sea ice shifts through needle patterns. Knowledge travels differently when held in song stitch or soot. So who etched the lines in these caves? Who decided which mark meant south, or this place feeds us? The truth is lost, but the shape of the story still lingers, and it points away from the solitary male explorer towards something broader, quieter, and more communal. You picture her again, stone in hand, tracing a path she walked 100 times. Not for ritual, not for pride, just so others wouldn't get lost. And centuries later, someone sees the mark and calls it meaningless, but not you. Because now we see these symbols not as chaos, but as coordinates. The fingerprints of women who mapped not just the land, but memory movement and the rhythm of life. They weren't just walking it, they were writing it. The skeleton lay curled on its side, nestled into the soil with care. Around it, beads grinding stones, fragments of ochre, and a small carved pendant. At first, no one paid much attention. It was cataloged, photographed, and labeled female burial, possibly domestic. The real excitement was 50 feet away, another skeleton, this one buried with a spearhead presumed male. Headlines would call it a warrior grave. But as more bones came to light, a troubling pattern emerged. Women were buried with stories, but no one stopped to read them. For over a century, archaeological bias shaped not just what got found, but what was looked at. Female graves, even when richly adorned, were rarely treated as significant. Offerings were explained away as trinkets or dowry items. Strong bones were called anomalies. Tools became accessories. And the absence of weapons, proof of passivity. But in recent decades, new methods have reopened those graves figuratively, and in some cases literally. Isotopic analysis of bones now allows researchers to study diet mobility and workload. And the results are surprising. Many so-called domestic women had protein-rich diets comparable to hunters, suggesting active roles in food acquisition. Some showed signs of heavy labor muscle attachments on the shoulders and arms, spinal compression from carrying weight, and healed fractures that tell stories of danger resilience and movement. Then there's the buried toolkit. In a famous Central European site, a woman was interred with flint blades, awls, hammerstones, and a belt pouch containing pigment. Early reports called her a weaver or craftswoman, but newer interpretations suggest she may have been a specialist, perhaps a leatherworker healer, or even a midwife. The tools weren't ceremonial, they were used. Still, the narrative lags behind. Textbooks continue to frame female graves in terms of reproduction or ritual. A woman with beads fertility symbol. A man with beads trade network leader. This interpretive double standard is slowly unraveling, but only with deliberate effort. Some scholars now argue for a reassessment of every early burial. Recode the objects, remeasure the bones, ask different questions. What if that polished stone wasn't decorative but medicinal? What if the shell bracelet signified status, not seduction? What if the bones we ignored for so long held a different kind of power? One not marked by weapons, but by wisdom. You picture her now lying beneath the earth, her story folded in layers of loam. She was someone, a guide, a maker, a keeper of knowledge, not an accessory to history, but an author. And perhaps if we listen closely, we can still hear the faint rustle of beads, the scrape of flint on hide, the breath she took as she shaped a world we're only now learning to see. The grave wasn't silent. We just weren't listening. You step into a museum gallery, dimly lit softly, humming with the buzz of climate control. Along the walls, ancient tools, figurines, and fragments of cave art sit behind glass. The plaques are tidy, the fonts tasteful. And everywhere, the same quiet message repeats: prehistory was male. From Paris to Chicago, from Berlin to Boston, the masculine lens has shaped not just what's displayed, but how we're taught to see it. It's subtle. No curator shouts it, but the pattern's there. A flint spearhead sits alone in a case labeled Hunter's Weapon. A carved figurine is tucked beside it, labeled Fertility Symbol. On another wall, a handprint replica is shown with a caption Early Man's Mark. The museum whispers the story, again and again, until we believe it. These narratives weren't created out of malice. Many museums inherited their frameworks from 19th and 20th century collectors whose worldviews were steeped in colonialism, sexism, and rigid roles. When those early displays were built, they reflected the scholar's assumptions, not the artifact's truths. And often, they've remained unchanged. Take the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, once a beacon of anthropology, now reckoning with its past. For decades, it displayed human evolution as a march of men, stooped apes, becoming upright hunters, each more rugged than the last. Where were the women, the caregivers, the gatherers, artisans, and engineers? Nowhere in sight. Similar issues arise in North America. The Field Museum in Chicago once displayed a diorama labeled Cave Life, featuring a man sharpening tools while a woman cradled a child in shadow. No evidence had proven that scene. It was just assumed. But slowly, things are shifting. New exhibits now include multiple perspectives, highlighting female roles in prehistory. Some even let visitors explore data behind the labels, see the isotopes, read the burial reports, decide for themselves. In Berlin, a traveling exhibit recently paired ancient tools with modern indigenous voices, showing how traditional women's skills endure in present-day communities. It felt more honest, more human. Still, progress is uneven. Many museums lag behind, especially smaller ones with limited funding. And institutional bias doesn't vanish overnight. Some curators fear controversy. Others cling to outdated models, arguing that reinterpretation equals revisionism. But it isn't revisionist to include the overlooked. It's restorative. You imagine a young girl visiting a museum peering into a case. She sees a flint knife labeled male hunting tool. She moves on. But if the label read, used by early humans, some fingerprints suggest female hands, everything changes. Suddenly, she belongs. Museums are stories we walk through. And the more accurate those stories become, the more we all get to see ourselves in them. So next time you pass a glass case, pause. Ask what's missing. Who's missing? Because even in silence, the walls remember. And the roles we assign are not carved in stone, they're written on labels. And labels can change. The past used to whisper through bone and soot. Now it speaks in code, genetic, isotopic, digital. With every scrape of a trowel and flicker of a scanner, modern technology is cracking open the old myths of cave life. And many of those myths, it turns out, were built on guesswork. especially the ones that claim to know who did what based solely on sex. Start with DNA. In a Siberian cave, a tiny fragment of bone barely distinguishable from a pebble was sequenced. It belonged to a young girl, but not just any girl. She was a hybrid, her father, a Denisovan, her mother Neanderthal. Her very existence rewrote human history. For years, we assumed these hominin groups kept to themselves. Now evidence shows they interbred, traveled together, maybe even co-parented. And when it comes to gender roles, ancient DNA has more surprises. In a Peruvian burial site, once believed to contain only male warriors, DNA revealed that nearly half the individuals were genetically female. These weren't symbolic burials or anomalies, they were hunters buried with weapons and prestige. The tools didn't lie, but the interpretations had. Isotope analysis, too, tells tales no eye can see. By studying the chemical signatures in teeth and bones, scientists can now track ancient diets, migration patterns, even weaning ages. In one Ice Age community, isotopes showed that some women consume more protein than men, suggesting they had greater access to meat, possibly due to roles in butchering distribution or hunting itself. And then there's 3D reconstruction. By digitally modeling wear on bones and joints, researchers can infer habitual movements, what kinds of loads someone carried, whether they knelt or climbed, whether their injuries healed fast or slow. In multiple sites, women's skeletons show signs of strength training, thickened bones, dense muscle attachments, and signs of repeated stress, consistent with tasks like long-distance hauling, hide scraping, or stone lifting. These bodies tell stories we can finally hear. And while some remain cautious, warning that data needs context, that patterns can be misread, the trend is clear. Technology isn't just confirming what we knew, it's overturning what we assumed. You picture the lab humming machines, chilled trays, fragments under glass, a tooth from a burial once dismissed as ritual female. A technician types, the sequence runs, and suddenly the record changes. Now we know she ate like a hunter, moved like a porter, died with wear in her joints from years of labor, and her tools not borrowed, worn smooth from use. This is not a revision, it's a recalibration. And with every scan model and data set, we draw closer to a more complete view of cave life, one where roles were shared, blurred, reshaped, a life less divided by our modern categories, and more attuned to necessity, skill, and context. In this new light, old shadows shift. The future is digging into the past, and it's finding her. A story once told enough times starts to sound like truth. That's how we ended up with the tale of man, the hunter, woman, the gatherer, and a neat gendered split that supposedly defined all of prehistory. It's a comfortable story, predictable, tidy, aligned with centuries of social norms. But comfort isn't accuracy. And now, with bones, pigments, and pixels on our side, we're beginning to tell a different story. Not a revision, but a restoration. This isn't about erasing men or denying their roles. It's about admitting that for generations, a massive cast of characters was cut from the script. Their scenes were left out, their contributions overlooked. And the result, a distorted view of humanity's origins, one that turned a shared survival into a single narrative voice. Rethinking the story doesn't mean we throw out everything. It means we read more carefully. We highlight the marginalia, the overlooked, the details once chalked up to coincidence or insignificance. It means that a handprint isn't just a decoration, but a declaration. That a hearth isn't just warmth, it's infrastructure. that a bead in a burial isn't just jewelry, it's biography. Consider the way we talk about agency. For centuries, prehistoric women were framed as passive supporting roles in a male-led drama, but new interpretations suggest they were not just participants, but innovators crafting tools, creating art mapping, terrain-shaping ritual. Not always in the spotlight, but never absent. Some scholars compare this shift to cleaning a foggy mirror. We're not seeing a new past, we're finally seeing what was always there. Others call it a deep rebalancing, a methodical undoing of inherited bias. And while consensus is far from reached, there's a growing willingness to ask, what did we miss because of who was telling the story? Textbooks are starting to reflect this. Exhibits, too. But the real change comes in imagination, in who we picture when we say early humans. Not just a bearded man with a club, but a woman threading sinew through bone, or a child pressing ochre-stained fingers to stone. You picture them now, all of them. Not staged like mannequins, but moving, working, arguing, laughing, crafting, leading. A dynamic community, not a hierarchy of roles defined by chromosomes, and you in the present have the rare privilege of being part of this retelling. You get to hold both versions, the old myth and the emerging truth, and feel the gap between them narrow. That's not something to fear. It's something to rest in. Because in rethinking the story of us, we're not rewriting history to suit an agenda. We're allowing history to speak in full voice-layered, contradictory, textured, and true. And maybe that's the real gift of modern archaeology, not just uncovering bones or pigments, but recovering complexity. Letting silence give way to signal. Letting the wall at last tell the whole story. The cave still holds secrets, not just the painted ones hiding under soot, or the bones sleeping under dust, but the ones that haven't yet been found. The ones that lie beyond the current edge of excavation, beneath another layer of earth, behind a wall, yet unscanned inside a figurine, yet to be reinterpreted. And so we end, not with certainty, but with curiosity. What might the next discovery reveal? And how might it shift the story again? Science moves forward in fits and starts. Each new tool, a finer scanner, a more precise isotope reading a better DNA sequencer, expands what's possible. And with each new insight, the picture of cave life becomes richer, weirder, more nuanced. It's no longer just a saga of hunters and hearths, but of innovators, caretakers, artists, travelers, and thinkers, many of whom likely defied every neat label we've tried to give them. Some archaeologists now dream of recovering pigments directly from inside painted figures to understand sourcing and trade. Others want to run sound tests in previously silent chambers to recreate what the caves might have echoed, like during ceremonies. There are plans for AI-assisted reconstructions of worn engravings and even scent analysis to determine what herbs, resins, or cooked meals might have filled the air. The cave, once thought, still is very much alive with possibility. And let's not forget the global picture. So much of what we know comes from Europe, where preservation has favored stone and bone. But what of the tropics, the Arctic, the islands lost to rising seas? Cultures with rich oral traditions, some never represented in pigment or figurine, may have left traces in forms we've yet to recognize as meaningful. There could be entire traditions of storytelling, mapping, crafting, or healing that simply don't survive in the fossil record, but do survive in descendant cultures. To imagine future discoveries is to stretch the boundaries of what we allow ourselves to believe. It means being willing to let go of the hero myths, the linear progressions, the gendered scripts we inherited without question. It means making room for contradiction, for new names, for roles we haven't even thought to name yet. And it means asking new kinds of questions, not just who hunted or who painted, but who taught, who remembered, who shaped the rituals that shaped the group you imagine a cave yet undiscovered. Somewhere, a rock slide covers its mouth. Behind it, a mural complex crowded layered waits in perfect silence. One day, someone will find it. They'll enter, not with assumptions, but with awe. And when they do, they'll add another thread to the great tapestry of human story, a thread we don't yet know how to name. Because the past isn't done with us, not even close. And now, as the torchlight fades and the cave walls settle back into shadow, you can let the stories rest alongside you. The hands pressed into stone, the pigments swept in arcs, the quiet hum of tasks completed, all of it still echoes if you listen closely. Not loudly, just enough to remind you that history was never a single voice, but a layered harmony, sometimes forgotten, often misread, always waiting. Let the silence wrap around you, now soft as hide, warm as firelight. The figures on the wall are still there, but they no longer need to be explained. They simply are. Their mysteries can sleep beside yours. And if you'd like to return to stories like this, you can always subscribe quietly, of course. But before you drift off, tell me, where are you? What time is it? And who's your favorite forgotten historical figure?